There's a strange thing you'll notice if you ever read about the very wealthy. On paper, some of them look almost incomeless. Tiny salaries, small taxable income, a rate that can end up lower than the one your accountant quotes you on a normal working wage. And the first time you hear that, it sounds like a trick, a secret, something illegal happening in a back room. It isn't. It's just a pattern built right into how the whole system treats owning versus earning, and nobody ever sat you down and explained it. So today I'm going to explain it, not sell it to you. Explain it. Quick, honest promise before we start. This is education, not a how-to for dodging tax. And I'll say that again at the end. What we're doing is opening the rulebook to one specific rule and reading it in plain English, so a thing that looks like magic stops looking like magic. Here's the path. First, the one asymmetry the whole tax code is built on. Why selling costs you and holding doesn't. Then the three moves people nickname buy, borrow, die, buy assets instead of cash, borrow against them instead of selling, and a concept called step up that explains why heirs matter to the math. Then the honest catch, why this needs real scale and carries real risk. And finally, the part that actually matters for you, not the loophole, the lesson. So let's open it. Every episode in this series we open the same book. The rule book the wealthy treat is obvious, and the rest of us were simply never handed. Rule 4 is a quiet one. It doesn't shout. It's written almost like an afterthought, and yet it shapes more real fortunes than almost anything else in here. The rule reads like this. The tax code doesn't tax what you own. It taxes what you sell. Read that twice, because everything else today grows out of that single sentence. Owning is not a taxable event. Selling is. The wealthy build their entire relationship with money around which side of that line they're standing on. Here's the asymmetry, and it's the whole engine. Imagine you own something that has climbed in value. Shares in a broad fund, a building, a stake in a business. On paper, you're up, maybe way up. But here's the strange part. Until you actually sell it, that gain is invisible to the tax system. It's called an unrealized gain, and the word that matters is unrealized. You made money technically, but you haven't triggered anything. The moment you sell, you realize the gain, and that's the moment a tax bill is born. Same asset, same value, but selling flips a switch that holding never touches. Hold, and the clock never starts. That is the seam the whole playbook runs through. Let's sit with that first idea, because it's the foundation and most people have never had it spelled out. When you earn a paycheck, tax comes off the top before the money ever reaches you. You never even see the full amount. Earning is taxed instantly, automatically, at the source. But an asset you own works on completely different rules. Say you bought into a broad index fund years ago and it's doubled. That doubling is real wealth. You could borrow against it, you could plan your whole life around it. And yet, because you haven't sold, the tax system treats it as if nothing has happened. No sale, no realized gain, no bill. Now flip it. The day you sell to spend the money, you realize that gain, and a chunk of it, is owed. So watch what that quietly does to behavior. If selling is the thing that creates the tax, then the obvious move, if you can afford to, is to not sell, to hold, to let the asset keep growing untouched while the tax bill stays unborn. Sometimes for decades. This is why you'll hear that the wealthy are asset-rich. It's not just that they own a lot, it's that selling is the one move they've organized their lives to avoid, because selling is the only move that hands the tax collector a bill. Earning is taxed on the way in, selling is taxed on the way out. Holding sits in the middle, untaxed, patient, compounding. And once you truly see that middle lane exists, you start to understand why someone with real assets would rather do almost anything than step out of it. Nobody's cheating. They're just standing very deliberately on the side of the line that doesn't trigger the switch. So that's the why. Now the first move, buy. And this is where it splits from how most of us are taught to handle money. Most people are taught to accumulate cash, save it, pile it, keep it safe in an account. But cash has a quiet problem. It slowly loses value to inflation, and it doesn't grow on its own. The wealthy tend to do the opposite. They convert cash, as fast as is sensible, into things that appreciate, assets that tend to climb in value over time. Ownership stakes in businesses, broad baskets of shares, real estate, productive things. The mindset flip is this. Cash is something you spend, assets are something you own and hold. And remember Rule 4. Owning isn't taxed, only selling is. So the more of your wealth that lives inside appreciating assets rather than cash, the more of it is quietly growing in that untaxed middle lane we just talked about. That's the buy, borrow, die. Not buy stuff, buy assets. Buy the kind of thing that pays you or grows for you, and then, this is the crucial part, hold it so you never trip the selling switch. Now, one honest note, because this channel doesn't do fairy tales, appreciating assets don't only go up. Markets fall, buildings sit empty, businesses fail. It'll grow forever is exactly the kind of confidence that gets people hurt. The pattern works over long stretches and on average and with diversification, not on any single bet and not on any single year. So, buy assets not cash isn't a guarantee. It's a direction. The direction is, own the things that tend to grow, hold them long enough for time to do the work, and understand that owning them puts you on the untaxed side of the line, while cash slowly leaks value on the other. Here's the move that makes people's eyes widen. Borrow. Follow the logic. You've got a big pile of appreciating assets. You need money to actually live, to spend, to buy things, to fund your life. The normal answer is, sell some assets and spend the proceeds. But we just established selling is the one move that triggers the tax. So is there another way to turn assets into spendable money without selling them? There is, and it's not exotic. It's a loan. You borrow money using your assets as collateral, the same basic idea as a mortgage or a home equity line, just scaled up. And here's the piece that surprises people. A loan is not income. When someone lends you money, you haven't earned anything. You've taken on a debt you have to pay back. So borrowed money generally isn't taxed the way a paycheck or a sale is. That's not a loophole someone invented. It's just what a loan is. You didn't gain wealth, you borrowed it. So the picture becomes, hold the appreciating assets, never sell, and instead borrow against them to fund your life, spending money that isn't taxed as income while the assets keep growing untouched behind it. Now stop, because this is the most important part of this whole segment, and it's where the fantasy versions leave things out. Borrowing against your assets is not free money and it is not risk-free. You pay interest, that loan costs you every year. If the assets you borrowed against drop in value, the lender can demand more collateral or force a sale at the worst possible moment, the exact thing you were trying to avoid. Debt has to be serviced in good markets and bad. Done carelessly or without enormous assets behind it, this move can bury a person instead of freeing them. It works for the very wealthy precisely because they have so much collateral that the loan is a small, safe fraction of what they own. Strip away that cushion, and it becomes dangerous fast. Now the last word in the nickname, and I promise to keep this gentle and purely conceptual. Die. This is where the heirs come in, and it's the piece that ties the whole thing together. Follow it slowly. Imagine someone held appreciating assets their whole life and never sold. So that big unrealized gain, the one we've been talking about, was never realized, never taxed. Then they pass away, and the assets go to their heirs. Here's the concept, and it's called a step-up in basis. In plain English, for tax purposes, the asset's value gets reset to whatever it's worth on the day it's inherited. The heirs are treated as if they acquired it at today's value, not the tiny price it was originally bought for decades ago. So all that built-up gain from a lifetime of holding, the gain that was never taxed because it was never sold, can effectively get wiped clean at the handoff. The heirs inherit the asset at the stepped-up value, and that old embedded gain doesn't follow it. That's the die in buy, borrow, die. Hold until the very end, and the unrealized gain may pass to the next generation without ever being realized as income the way a sale would have been. Now, I'm deliberately keeping this at the level of the concept because the actual rules involve estate tax, thresholds, exemptions, and details that change and that vary hugely by situation. And this is education, not advice, and definitely not a plan you should try to assemble from a video. But the shape is what matters for understanding. Buy and hold so nothing is realized. Borrow so you can spend without selling. And the step up at the end is the reason never selling can make sense all the way to the finish line. 3 moves, 1 logic. Stay on the untaxed side of that line the whole way through. Now the steel man, because if I stopped there, I'd be handing you a fantasy. And this episode is the one where being careful matters most. Here's the honest catch. Almost none of this works on a normal paycheck. Look back at what every single step quietly required. The buy step assumes you have real surplus to convert into appreciating assets, not a tight budget where every dollar is already spoken for. The borrow step assumes you have so much collateral that a loan is a tiny, safe slice of your net worth, cheap to service and easy to survive if markets dip. And the die step assumes there's a large enough estate for any of it to matter. Strip out the scale and the machine doesn't run. It just becomes ordinary debt against ordinary assets, which is exactly how regular people get into trouble. So I want to be really direct. This is not a hack you bolt onto a salary. It is not a one weird trick. Anyone selling it to you that way is selling you risk with the risk edited out. And here's the reframe that actually matters. The point of understanding this isn't to copy it. Most of us can't and shouldn't try. The point is to see clearly why the tax code behaves the way it does. It rewards owning over earning. It rewards holding over selling. It rewards patient, long-term ownership of productive things. That's not a secret trapdoor for a lucky few. It's the basic grain of the whole system, running quietly underneath everything. The wealthy aren't smarter than you here. They were just handed a rule book that made that grain obvious, and they organized their lives along it. You weren't handed the book. That's the only real difference. And now you're reading the same page they read. So here's the takeaway, and it's the whole reason we did this the careful way instead of the clickbait way. The valuable thing here was never the loophole. It's the lesson underneath it. Strip away the borrowing and the estates and the scale that regular life doesn't have, and what's left is a principle that applies to absolutely everyone, at any income. The system rewards owning and holding. That's it. That's the part you get to keep. The exotic version, borrow against a fortune, hold till the end, step it up for the heirs. That's for people with a fortune, and it carries real risk even for them. But the underlying direction it points in is available to you starting today. Own appreciating assets instead of only holding cash. And once you own them, hold. Because holding is the untaxed, compounding, patient lane, and selling is the switch that ends the growth and starts the bill. You don't need a mansion of collateral to use that idea. You just need to notice which behaviors the code quietly rewards and lean, gently, in that direction. The wealthy didn't find a cheat. They found the grain of the wood, and they cut with it instead of against it. That's the lesson. Not find a loophole. Cut with the grain. Own things that grow, and give them time by not selling them at the first opportunity. The most powerful part of this entire playbook isn't the fancy machinery on top. It's the boring sentence holding the whole thing up. The code favors owning and holding. So, within your means, own and hold. So what does the average person version actually look like? The part you can use without a fortune, an army of lawyers, or any of the risk we spent this whole video naming. It's smaller than the headline, and that's the good news. Because small and boring is the part that's real. 1. Own appreciating assets, not just cash. Over the long run, turn some of what you save into things that tend to grow. Broad, diversified, low-cost ownership rather than a pile of cash slowly losing to inflation. 2. Hold for the long run. Let time compound in that untaxed middle lane, and don't yank the money out at the first wobble, because every sale is a switch you're choosing to flip. 3. Borrow carefully, if ever. Understand that debt against an asset is a real tool and a real danger, and that it only makes sense when it's a small, safe fraction of what you own and you can service it comfortably. Never a shortcut, never a way to spend money you don't have. That's the whole usable version. Own, hold, and borrow with enormous caution, or not at all. And I'll say the thing I promised I'd say. This is education, not financial advice. I'm explaining a concept so it stops looking like a secret. I'm not telling you what to do with your money, and the details here get complicated and personal fast. If you're making real decisions, that's a conversation for a professional who knows your actual situation. So here's my question for the comments, and I really do want to know, did anyone ever explain this to you in school? Because they didn't explain it in mine, and it shapes almost everything about how wealth actually works. One more time, plainly. This is education, not financial advice. It's a page of the Rulebook, read out loud, nothing more. Next time we open Rule 5, and it might be my favorite one. The rich buy time, the poor buy stuff. Why the flashiest lives are often the least wealthy, and what the truly rich spend money on that you can't photograph. I'll see you there.